As the family sat together at dinner one evening, reflecting on how much had changed in a year, their father smiled. "Sometimes," he said, "the biggest changes start with the hardest moments." Outside their window, an officer walked his beat, stopping to help a young child retrieve a ball that had rolled into the street. It was a simple moment, but it represented everything they had worked to achieve. A community where everyone looked out for each other, where trust was built daily through small actions and genuine connections. 6 months after that evening on Maple Street, the changes in the community were impossible to miss. The state senator's new legislation, now known as the Community Trust and Safety Act, had passed with overwhelming support. But the real story wasn't in the law books, it was in the daily life of the neighborhood. The sister, now in her final semester of high school, walked into the community center where she'd helped establish a youth leadership program. Inside, local police officers sat with students, not for formal meetings, but for homework help sessions and mentoring. One of the officers who had been present that night was now a regular volunteer, helping kids with their math homework. "When I started this program," she told a visiting news crew, "I wanted to turn our experience into something positive. I never expected it would grow this big." The program had spread to 3 other districts, with more communities asking to join every month. The brother dribbled down the basketball court during a championship game, the stands packed with familiar faces. Local officers cheered alongside parents and teachers, the same officers who now regularly joined practice sessions and pickup games. The wall behind the bleachers displayed a new banner: "One community, many stories, shared future." Their father, the senator, had transformed too. His legislative work now focused heavily on community police relations, but with a unique approach. "Every law we pass," he often said, "needs to come from real community experiences and real solutions." He turned his weekly community meetings into a model that other districts were starting to copy. The police department looked different as well. The changes weren't just in policies or procedures, they were in attitudes and relationships. Officers walked their beats differently now, greeting residents by name, stopping to chat with shop owners, joining in when kids played street basketball. The chief had implemented what he called community immersion training, when new officers spent their first month getting to know the neighborhood they'd serve. One particularly touching change happened at the local high school. The retired teacher who had witnessed everything that night worked with current students to create a new course called Community Leadership and Civil Rights. The sister was invited back to speak to the first class, sharing her experience and the positive changes that followed. The local grocery store, where the kids had bought snacks after school for years, became an unofficial community hub. The owner had set up a bulletin board where people could post about community events, including the new monthly Coffee with Cups, meetings where residents and officers could chat informally over coffee and pastries. The brothers' basketball team had started a new tradition. Before each home game, they invited local officers to join them in a pre-game huddle. What started as a gesture of reconciliation had become a symbol of community unity, photographed and shared by local media as an example of positive change. The sister's college applications had been updated to reflect her new role in the community. Her essay about wanting to become a civil rights attorney now included real experience in creating change. Universities weren't just impressed by her academic achievements, they were impressed by how she had helped transform a potentially negative incident into a movement for positive change. The officers who had been involved that night had become unexpected advocates for reform. They spoke at police training sessions across the state, sharing their experience and the lessons learned. "We thought we were doing our job that night," one officer told a training class. "Now we understand that our job is about more than procedures, it's about community." Crime rates in the neighborhood had dropped significantly. The police chief attributed this not to stricter enforcement, but to stronger community bonds. "When people know their local officers as neighbors and mentors," he explained at a community meeting, "when kids see us as coaches and tutors, that's when real safety happens." The local news reporter who had covered the original incident wrote a 1-year follow-up story. She interviewed the family, the officers, and community members. But her most powerful interview was with a young student who hadn't even been present that night on Maple Street. "I used to be scared when I saw police cars in our neighborhood," the student said. "Now I wave because I probably know who's driving." The senator's children had grown from the experience too. The sister was preparing for college, planning to study law with a focus on community advocacy. The brother had become a peer mentor, helping younger students understand their rights while building positive relationships with law enforcement. The morning after the incident, videos from Maple Street had already spread across social media. The local news coverage showed multiple angles of what happened, from neighbors' phone recordings to the professional news footage. But what happened next surprised everyone, including the officers involved. The state senator's office was flooded with calls, not just from angry constituents demanding action, but from community members offering support and suggesting solutions. The sister's debate team coach called to offer her students help in researching similar incidents. The brothers' basketball teammates and their parents organized a peaceful community meeting at the local gym. Instead of holding press conferences or making angry statements, the senator took a different approach. He invited the police chief, community leaders, and even the officers involved to a town hall meeting. The high school auditorium was packed. Teachers sat next to shop owners, coaches next to clergy members, students next to senior citizens. "What happened to my children yesterday?" the senator began, his voice carrying through the crowded room. "Could have happened to any of our children. But instead of focusing on what went wrong, let's talk about how we can make things right." The crowd fell silent, surprised by his approach. The sister stood up to speak, her voice steady as she shared her experience. She didn't talk about fear or anger. Instead, she talked about hope. "I saw our community come together last night," she said. "I saw neighbors standing up for what's right. That's the real story here." Her brother spoke next, still wearing his varsity jacket. "My teammates and their families were there for us," he said. "They didn't just watch, they showed up. That's what community means." The basketball coach nodded proudly from his seat, remembering how his players had already suggested dedicating their next game to community unity. What made this town hall different was who else spoke. One of the officers from the incident stood up, his voice slightly shaky but determined. "I've been on the force for 12 years, he said. "Last night made me realize we need to do better. We need to know our community better." His honesty brought tears to some eyes and nods of appreciation from others. The local grocery store owner shared how he'd watched the senator's children grow up, coming to his store for snacks after school. The retired teacher reminded everyone how she taught 2 generations of local kids. These weren't just speeches, they were stories of real connections, real community. As the meeting continued, something remarkable happened. People didn't just complain, they offered solutions. The high school principal suggested including police officers in school events. The community center director proposed joint workshops between officers and local youth. The local tech company offered to fund body cameras with better accountability features. The senator listened to everyone, taking notes just like he did in legislative sessions. But this wasn't politics as usual, this was community building in real time. His children sat nearby, watching their father turn a potentially divisive incident into an opportunity for positive change. In the days that followed, draft legislation emerged that went beyond simple police reform. It included funding for community programs, requirements for officer training in community relations, and new accountability measures. But more importantly, it had input from everyone: police officers, community members, legal experts, and young people. The local police department didn't wait for the legislation to pass. They immediately started making changes. Officers began attending community events not as security, but as participants. The chief established regular meetings with student leaders. The officers involved in the incident asked to be part of the new training program, sharing their experience as a learning opportunity. The brothers' basketball team started inviting local officers to their practices, breaking down barriers through simple conversation and shared activity. The sisters' debate team organized a series of discussions about community police relations, bringing together different perspectives in a respectful forum. What made this response different was its focus on building bridges rather than burning them. The senator could have used his position to demand punitive action. Instead, he showed how leadership means bringing people together, especially, when it's difficult. The local news reporter who covered the original incident wrote a follow-up story titled "From Confrontation to Conversation: How One Incident Changed a Community." She detailed how a potentially negative situation had transformed into a movement for positive change, led by those who had the most reason to be angry. As the officers began to realize the full implications of what had transpired, the senator turned to his children. His face softened as he checked on them, making sure they were okay. In that moment, he wasn't a state senator. He was simply a father whose kids had experienced something no parent wants their children to go through. The evening would end without arrests or escalated confrontations, but everyone present knew they had witnessed something significant. This wasn't just about one traffic stop or one family. It was about a community coming together, about dignity in the face of injustice, and about how sometimes the quietest responses can spark the loudest changes. The state senator stood quietly for a moment, his presence commanding attention without a single word spoken. His children's school belongings lay scattered around their SUV, telling the story of what had transpired. He adjusted his glasses, a habit his constituents knew well from his speeches at the State House. But this wasn't a political moment. This was deeply personal. "Good evening, officers," he said, his voice carrying the same measured tone he used in legislative sessions. He didn't raise his voice or make demands. Instead, he pulled out his phone and began methodically documenting everything he saw: the scattered school supplies, his children's composed but tired faces, the gathering of neighbors with their phones raised. The officers straightened their postures, clearly recognizing him now. "Senator, we were responding to a report of a suspicious vehicle," the first officer began, but his voice trailed off as the senator held up his hand, not in dismissal, but in a gesture asking for a moment to complete his documentation. "I'd like to understand something," the senator said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "My children were driving home from school in our family vehicle, wearing their school uniforms, with their student parking permits clearly displayed. What made this vehicle suspicious?" The question hung in the air, heavy with unspoken implications. The local news crew had their cameras rolling, capturing every word. The reporter who lived down the street wasn't just covering a story, she was witnessing her neighbor's experience firsthand. The grocery store owner who had watched these kids grow up stood nearby, still in his work apron, shaking his head at what he was seeing. "We have procedures we need to follow," the second officer started to explain, but the senator nodded thoughtfully, cutting him off with his next question. "And does that procedure include searching a vehicle without probable cause or consent?" "I'd be very interested in reviewing that policy at our next legislative session on law enforcement guidelines." The crowd of neighbors had grown larger, but remained respectfully quiet, understanding the significance of what they were witnessing. The retired civics teacher who lived next door was recording everything, already planning how this real-life example would become part of next semester's lessons on civil rights and community activism. The senator turned to address the growing number of cameras. "What we're seeing here tonight isn't just about my children. It's about every child in our community, every family who's ever felt unfairly targeted, every citizen who deserves to be treated with dignity and respect." His words weren't rehearsed or political. They came from a father's heart, shaped by years of public service. He then did something unexpected. Instead of demanding immediate action against the officers, he pulled out his business card and handed it to them. "I'd like to invite both of you to my office tomorrow, not for a reprimand, but for a conversation. We need to discuss how we can prevent situations like this from happening to anyone else's children." The sister's college application essays about wanting to become a civil rights attorney lay scattered near her feet. She picked them up, realizing she was living through the kind of moment that would shape her future career. Her brother stood tall beside her, his varsity jacket a reminder that they were just teenagers who should have been home doing homework by now. The officers began to look uncomfortable, not from intimidation, but from the growing realization of how this situation had escalated. The senator's calm demeanor made their earlier actions seem even more excessive in contrast. The body cameras they wore had captured everything, and they knew this incident would become more than just another traffic stop report. Community members had formed a loose circle around the scene, their phones still recording. The local baker, who always donated to school fundraisers, stood next to the retired nurse who volunteered at the community center. The high school basketball coach who had mentored the brother was there too, his presence a silent statement of support. "I believe," the senator continued, his voice still measured and clear, "that this is an opportunity to examine our procedures, to strengthen our community bonds, and to ensure that every citizen feels safe in their own neighborhood. He gestured to the gathered crowd. "Look around. These aren't just spectators. These are members of a community who stand up for each other." The neighborhood had transformed into an impromptu gathering of concerned citizens. Dr. Wilson's call to the State House set off a chain reaction that would change everything. The state senator was in the middle of an important budget meeting when his assistant burst in, phone in hand, face grave with concern. Back on Maple Street, more neighbors had joined the growing crowd. The retired high school principal, who lived 3 doors down, was live streaming the entire incident. The owner of the local grocery store, still wearing his work apron, stood with his arms crossed, watching intently. These weren't just observers, they were members of a tight-knit community witnessing something they never thought would happen on their street. "I sent the video to 3 news stations," whispered a local mom who ran a popular community blog. The soft blue glow of phone screens lit up the darkening street as more residents documented everything. The siblings could hear snippets of conversations. "Those are the senator's kids. I've known that family for years. This isn't right." The sister felt a mix of emotions as she watched her college application essays scattered across the car seats. She'd spent months perfecting them, writing about her dreams of becoming a civil rights attorney. Now she was living through exactly the kind of situation she'd written about wanting to prevent. The brother stood tall despite the evening chill, his varsity jacket no longer just a symbol of athletic achievement, but a clear identifier of who he was: a student, an athlete, a member of this community. His teammates' parents were among the crowd, their presence a silent testament to his character. Suddenly, a buzz went through the gathered neighbors. The local news van had just turned onto the street, its presence adding another layer of scrutiny to the scene. The officers continued their search, but their movements had become more measured, more conscious of the growing audience. That's when they heard it, the distinctive sound of the state senator's car turning onto Maple Street. He'd left the budget meeting immediately, not even stopping to grab his coat. The crowd parted as his car pulled up, and the atmosphere shifted palpably. This wasn't just a concerned parent arriving, this was a public servant who had dedicated his life to making their state better for everyone. The senator stepped out of his car with the quiet dignity that had earned him respect across party lines. He was still wearing his reading glasses and carrying his legislative folder, evidence of how quickly he'd left the State House. But it was the look in his eyes that caught everyone's attention. This wasn't the polished politician they saw on TV. This was a father seeing his children standing in the cold while their rights were being violated. He approached calmly, his official State House ID already in hand. The neighbors watched as he walked past them, many reaching out to pat his shoulder or murmur words of support. The evidence of the community's solidarity was overwhelming. Phones recording, people standing witness, local media documenting every moment. The brother and sister stood a little straighter as their father approached. They had followed every lesson he taught them about handling situations like this. Stay calm, know your rights, maintain your dignity. Now they watched as he prepared to put his own teachings into practice. The local reporter who lived down the street was already doing a live broadcast. "We're on Maple Street where state senator and beloved community leader has just arrived at the scene where his children, both honor students at the local high school, have been detained." The officer's demeanor shifted as they recognized the senator, but he wasn't focused on them yet. His first steps took him to his children, where he placed a gentle hand on each of their shoulders. The touch carried years of love, pride, and silent understanding. The crowd fell quiet, sensing they were witnessing something significant. As the senator turned to address the officers, everyone knew this moment would be remembered. Not just because of who he was, but because of what this incident represented: a community standing up for its own, technology enabling transparency, and the power of maintaining dignity in the face of injustice. The evening had started with 2 teenagers driving home from school. Now it had become a moment that would spark conversations in homes, schools, and legislative halls across the state. The neighbors who witnessed it firsthand would later say it wasn't just about what happened to those 2 teenagers, it was about what happened next, how their community responded, and how one incident on a quiet suburban street would lead to changes nobody could have predicted. What the officers didn't realize was that with every passing minute, as they searched for something they wouldn't find, they were actually uncovering something else: the strength of a community united in support of its own. The siblings stood straight and dignified in the growing darkness, surrounded by neighbors who knew their character, their family, and their truth. Little did anyone know that this evening would become a turning point, not just for their family or their neighborhood, but for the entire state's approach to law enforcement and community relations. As the search continued under the watchful eyes of dozens of witnesses, a movement was being born, one that would grow from this single incident into something much bigger than anyone could have imagined. Last edited 11 hours ago, the autumn wind picked up as the officer returned to their window, his flashlight beam still steady on the teenagers' faces. "Step out of the vehicle," he commanded, his tone leaving no room for discussion. The siblings shared a quick glance, their parents' teachings running through their minds. "May I ask why, officer?" the sister asked politely, her voice steady despite her racing heart. Their father had always emphasized knowing their rights while remaining respectful. The officer's response was immediate. "We need to search the vehicle." "Do you have a warrant?" the brother asked carefully, remembering the civil rights workshops their parents had made them attend. The second officer moved closer, his hand still resting on his belt. "We have probable cause," he stated, though no explanation of that cause was offered. The evening air felt colder than usual as they carefully stepped out of their SUV, moving slowly and deliberately as they'd been taught. Their school uniforms offered little protection against the chill, but that wasn't why they were shivering. Around them, the neighborhood had come alive with concerned faces in windows and on porches. Mrs. Baker, their elderly neighbor who always gave out the best Halloween candy, was now standing on her front lawn in her gardening apron, phone raised and recording. More neighbors were gathering, maintaining a respectful distance but making their presence known. The community's silent support wrapped around the siblings like an invisible shield. The officers directed them to stand by the curb, hands visible, while they began searching the SUV. The sister watched as they opened her backpack, homework assignments and debate team notes spilling onto the seat. The brothers' basketball rolled out when they opened the back door, bouncing once before settling in the grass. "Our father is a state senator," the sister tried again, her voice clear in the evening air. "You can call his office to verify." The officers continued their search without acknowledging her words. More phone cameras appeared on surrounding porches, their lenses capturing every moment of the escalating situation. Through the growing crowd of neighbors, Dr. Wilson, still in his hospital scrubs from his emergency room shift, approached the police cars. "I've known these kids their whole lives," he called out, his voice carrying the authority of a respected community member. "They're honest students. This isn't right." The search continued, thorough and methodical. The siblings stood together, drawing strength from each other and the growing presence of their neighbors. The brother noticed his debate team certificate flutter out of his folder as the officers rifled through his backpack. The sister watched her carefully organized college application materials scatter across the seats. The neighborhood had never felt so quiet and so alive at the same time. The usual evening sounds, dogs barking, kids playing, dinner preparations, had been replaced by murmurs of concern and the clicking of phone cameras. The community was bearing witness, ensuring that this moment wouldn't pass unnoticed or undocumented. Dr. Wilson had stepped closer, his phone now pressed to his ear. "I'm on with their father's office," he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear. Other neighbors were making calls too, to local news stations, to community leaders, to anyone who might help ensure this situation didn't escalate further. The sister thought about their mother's upcoming community fundraiser posters, now crumpled in the back seat. The event was meant to bring people together, to strengthen community bonds. Looking around at their neighbors standing vigil, she realized those bonds were already stronger than any official event could make them. Time seemed to move differently as the search continued. Every minute felt like an hour, yet everything was happening so fast. The brother noticed his teammate's mom, a local journalist, taking notes while recording. Their middle school principal had appeared, still wearing her office clothes, her presence adding another layer of community authority to the scene. The officers were professional but thorough, checking every compartment, every bag, every corner of the SUV. They found exactly what anyone who knew the siblings would expect: schoolwork, sports equipment, community event flyers, and the ordinary possessions of two busy high school students. What happened in the next few minutes would shake their faith in the system their father worked within, but it would also show them the strength of their community and the importance of staying true to the principles their parents had taught them. As the officer returned to their window, neither sibling knew that this ordinary evening was about to become extraordinary in ways they never could have imagined. The red and blue lights filled their rearview mirror, painting the inside of their SUV in alternating colors. The sister's hands tightened on the steering wheel as she remembered everything their parents had taught them. Stay calm. Move slowly. Keep your hands visible. "I didn't do anything wrong," she said quietly, more to herself than to her brother. Her mind raced through the last few minutes of driving. She used her turn signals, stayed under the speed limit, stopped completely at every sign. The brother put down his phone and sat up straighter, his basketball jacket suddenly feeling too warm despite the autumn chill. Following their parents' careful instructions, she turned on the interior lights and slowly pulled over to the right side of Maple Street, making sure to leave enough room for safety. The familiar houses of their neighborhood now seemed like silent witnesses to what was unfolding. Two police cruisers had stopped behind them, an unusual show of force for a routine traffic stop. The siblings exchanged glances, their earlier light conversation about weekend plans evaporating into the tense air. Through the side mirror, they could see two officers emerging from their vehicles, hands already resting on their equipment belts. "License and registration ready?" the brother asked, his voice steady despite the situation. His sister nodded, already reaching for her wallet with deliberate slowness. Their father's voice echoed in their minds. "Always keep your documents easily accessible. No sudden movements." The first officer approached the driver's side while his partner stood back, watching intently. The flashlight beam swept through their car windows, momentarily blinding them. Their school backpacks were visible in the back seat, along with the brothers' basketball and a poster for their mother's upcoming community fundraiser. "Good evening, officer," the sister said clearly, keeping her hands at 10 and 2 on the steering wheel, just as she'd been taught. The beam of the flashlight moved from her face to her brother's, then back again. "Do you know why I pulled you over?" the officer asked, his tone clipped and professional. Before she could answer, he continued, "We've had reports of a vehicle matching this description involved in suspicious activity." The brother wanted to point out that there were probably dozens of silver SUVs in their suburb, but he remembered his father's advice. Stay respectful, stay calm, don't argue. Their student parking permits and honor roll stickers were clearly visible on the rear window. Their school uniforms should have been obvious indicators of who they were and where they'd been. "May I see your license and registration?" the officer asked, his flashlight still trained on them. The sister nodded, speaking clearly, "My license is in my wallet, and the registration is in the glove compartment. I'm going to reach for them now." Each movement was telegraphed, slow and deliberate. The brother sat perfectly still, hands open and visible on his lap. Through the windows of nearby homes, they could see curious faces appearing, neighbors drawn by the unusual sight of police lights in their quiet community. The second officer had moved closer now, watching every movement intently. The sister handed over her license with steady hands, then reached for the registration. The flashlight followed her every move, creating dancing shadows inside the car. "This vehicle is registered to a state senator," the first officer noted, his tone changing slightly as he examined the documents. The sister nodded, "Yes, sir. That's our father." She could see the officer's expression shift, but he continued his questioning. A few houses down, Mrs. Chen, who had known them since they were in elementary school, had come out onto her porch. Other neighbors were gathering too, sensing that something wasn't right about this stop. The siblings could see phones being raised, recording the scene that was unfolding on their quiet suburban street. The officer stepped back, speaking quietly into his radio. The siblings waited, their hearts pounding but their exteriors calm. They'd been prepared for moments like this, but experiencing it was different from all the family discussions around the dinner table. More lights were coming on in nearby houses. The neighborhood, usually settling into its quiet evening routine by this time, was awakening to the scene. The brother noticed their neighbor, Dr. Wilson, already on his phone, likely calling their parents. The community looked out for its own. The autumn sun was setting as two teenagers drove home from their high school, the kind of peaceful evening that usually marked the end of a busy day. The brother and sister pair had just finished their after-school activities. She had led the debate team meeting while he wrapped up basketball practice. The family's silver SUV glided smoothly through the familiar streets of their suburban neighborhood, a route they'd taken hundreds of times before. "Don't forget to tell Dad about the championship next week," the sister reminded her younger brother as she carefully signaled before making a turn. She'd gotten her license 6 months ago and still took extra care with every traffic rule. Their father had taught them both that being extra careful was just part of life for them. The brother was scrolling through his phone, checking the group chat about tomorrow's practice schedule. "Already texted him," he replied, glancing up at the golden-orange sky. "He said he'll try to make it, but you know how busy it gets at the State House this time of year." The car radio played softly in the background as they discussed their weekend plans. Their mum was organizing another community fundraiser, and they'd promised to help set up the tables and decorations at the community center. Their father, despite his busy schedule as a state senator, always made time to support these local events. "Did you see Mrs. Parker waving at us?" the sister asked, smiling as they passed their old elementary school teacher's house. The neighborhood was like that, familiar faces, friendly waves, and a sense of community they'd grown up with. Kids were playing basketball in driveways, and elderly couples took their evening walks along the tree-lined streets. The brother adjusted his varsity jacket and turned up the heat slightly. "Getting chilly early this year," he observed, watching leaves dance across the street in the autumn breeze. "Remember when we used to jump in those leaf piles Mr. Wilson would make?" Their conversation drifted to memories of growing up in the neighborhood, the summer block parties, winter sledding down Parker Hill, and the time they helped organize a surprise birthday parade for their father right after he won the election. They were proud of their dad, how he worked tirelessly for their community, how he taught them to hold their heads high and always give back. The sister checked her rearview mirror, a habit their mother had drilled into them during driving lessons. Their parents had sat them down many times for what they called real talk, discussions about being extra cautious, about how to handle different situations, about why they needed to be more careful than their friends sometimes. It was just part of their reality, but it didn't diminish their spirit or their pride in who they were. "Hey, can we stop by the library tomorrow?" the brother asked, remembering his history project. "I need some books for that civil rights movement presentation." Their father had always encouraged them to know their history, to understand where they came from and what their ancestors had fought for. It made them appreciate their present circumstances even more. The neighborhood looked particularly beautiful that evening, with the setting sun casting long shadows through the trees. Halloween decorations were starting to appear on porches, and campaign signs for the upcoming local elections dotted the well-kept lawns. It was the kind of peaceful scene that made it easy to forget about the challenges that sometimes lay beneath the surface of suburban tranquility. They were just 2 blocks from home, already thinking about the homework they needed to finish and the dinner their mom had promised to cook, her famous lasagna that everyone in the neighborhood raved about at potlucks. The sister had just turned onto Maple Street, carefully checking her blind spot as their father had taught her. That's when everything changed. That's when the flashing lights appeared in their rearview mirror, and the ordinary fall evening suddenly became anything but routine. Neither of them could have known that the next few minutes would not only change their lives, but would spark a movement that would transform their entire community. They were just kids heading home from school, honor roll students who'd never been in trouble. Their father was a respected state senator, their mother a beloved community organizer. But none of that mattered when those police lights started flashing behind them. What happened next would test everything their parents had taught them about staying calm, about knowing their rights, and about turning challenges into opportunities for change.